Okay, guys, we're ready to wrap up chapter 19. This will be the last voiceover PowerPoint, and we're going to begin on page 755 with section 19.5, alveolar gas exchanges. This photograph, which is magnified 300 times, is showing some of the alveoli that have been sectioned. So what we've got here is an alveolus, part of which again has been cut. We have another one over here and another one over here. Remember, these are simple squamous, lined. And what this points out is the fact that there are actually pores between the alveoli. So there's gas, oxygen and CO2, that can move from one alveolus into another. There's a continuation pathway of airflow within the lungs across the alveolar walls from one alveolus to another. Well, that's kind of interesting. This is another view. I think we saw something similar in the last voiceover of an alveolus, and we can see again the simple squamous cells here. We pointed out in a previous PowerPoint of the surfactant secreting cell, denoted up here as a type 2 cell. And remember, this material surfactant, it decreases the surface tension of water within the alveolus so that it can be more easily reinflated when you inspire air. And how preemies often have difficulty because their respiratory systems are the last to form, and there isn't sufficient surfactant being produced because these cells aren't quite functioning yet. But what I do want to draw your attention to is another cell, this guy right here, that is found scrounging around inside the alveolus in a good kind of way. This is a macrophage. This is a type of white blood cell. It's actually a monocyte that has left the bloodstream, gone out into the tissues, in this case into the lungs, where it's there to phagocytize any potential pathogens, like COVID-19 viruses, which we know are impacting the respiratory systems of folks. So these are important parts of your lymphatic system, the immune system, that are there to phagocytize and neutralize potential bacteria, viruses, anything that could potentially cause problems. And they can, of course, move in and out through those pores, just like air can. So they're strategically placed, and they're monitoring our lungs for potential pathogenic infectious pathogens. We want to focus our attention next on gas exchange. Remember, this is taking place between the air sacs of the lungs, the alveoli, and the surrounding capillary beds that are covering the surface of all of those alveoli. So we have several different cross sections of capillaries here, and we have several different alveoli. And note the presence of what is referred to here as the respiratory membrane. It's a bit of a misnomer because this would give you the sense that this is just a singular structure, membrane versus membranes. But the reality is that this respiratory membrane is actually more than one single membrane. It's actually made up of two membranes. And so we see here the membrane of the simple squamous cell here, making up the wall of the alveolus. And then we have another membrane here of which happens to be simple squamous as well, right? That lines the capillary wall. So when we talk about oxygen or CO2 moving across the respiratory membrane, we need to keep in mind that it's not one, it's two membranes. It's the membrane of the simple squamous of the alveolar wall, and it's the membrane of the simple squamous of the capillary wall. This is a really interesting electron micrograph magnified 7,000 times that is showing 5 individual red blood cells that are squeezing through this capillary wall, which is one after another, really, right? They're coming one behind the other. That's how thin the capillary is, that these red blood cells have to move through in single file. But that's actually a good thing, because by moving through in single file, that optimizes the diffusion of the CO2 and the oxygen, as opposed to if there was a very thick blood vessel, like say a wide blood vessel like an artery or a vein, we'd have tens of thousands of red cells moving through, one next to another. In capillaries, they're so thin that red cells follow in single file, which again optimizes diffusion. The blood is also moving slower than it would be in a vein or an artery as well. So this is the passage of these cells, again, across or through the capillary. And these are the alveoli here. This is the wall of one alveolus in yellow. Here's the wall of another alveolus in yellow. And this is the center of the alveolus. This is where the air is. Okay, so let's talk more about the diffusion of CO2 and oxygen. We know that when we inhale air, we do so with the intent of taking that oxygen in the air that becomes part of the alveolus and delivering a lot of it into the bloodstream, right? And then the blood can carry that oxygen to the tissues like the muscle and the muscle cells, and actually all cells of our tissues need oxygen for aerobic respiration. One end product of aerobic respiration is CO2. We think of it as a waste product, right? Well, that waste product from the tissues has to be taken aboard the blood and then delivered to the capillaries of the lungs, and then that CO2 has to be diffused across that respiratory membrane into the alveolus, and then we exhale that, right? So incoming oxygen, outgoing CO2. And that diffusion that we're looking at here is taking place in the lungs between the alveoli and the blood capillaries. We talked earlier about how we denote the oxygen-poor blood as a blue color, while the oxygen-rich blood we denoted as red, right? So we're going to obey or adhere to that color coding process here. Blue oxygen-poor, red oxygen-rich. And we're looking at some numbers here, which are the partial pressures of both CO2 and oxygen. Remember, capital P with a subscript CO2 or P subscript O2, partial pressure. And we said that gases always move from higher partial pressures to lower partial pressures until some sort of equilibrium is reached. So let's look at the blood coming in now from the tissues. It's been taken to the right half of the heart. The right ventricle will pump that blood into the pulmonary arteries, and then those pulmonary arteries will carry those into pulmonary arterioles and eventually into the capillaries. And so here comes that oxygen-poor blood in blue with a PCO2 of 45 millimeters of mercury and a PO2 of 40. So even though we think of this as oxygen-poor blood, there is some oxygen in it, okay, as evidenced by the 40 millimeters of mercury. Just keep that in mind. It's not oxygen-deficient blood, it's oxygen-poor blood. Let's look at the PCO2 and PO2 in the alveoli, okay? And we note that the PCO2 is 40 and the PO2 is 104. So when we look at the PCO2 in the blood and the PCO2 in the alveolus, in which place is it higher? Well, it's higher here in the blood, right? PCO2 of 45 as opposed to the PCO2 in the alveolus, which is 40. So this arrow is indicating the diffusion of the CO2 from the blood into the alveolus. Now, will this number go down to 0? The answer is no. It can only go down to the same number as it is in the alveolus, because that would be an equilibrium state that we have reached. Okay, so the PCO2 will drop from 45 to 40. So if you look at the exiting blood leaving the lungs, it has a PCO2 of 40, the same as in the alveolus. But look at what happens to the PO2. That's the interesting thing here, not to diminish CO2, but let's look at PO2 now. PO2 of incoming blood from the tissues of 40 compared to a PO2 in the alveolus of 104. It's much, much higher, isn't it, here in the alveolus, which we'd expect because we just took in inhalation of air. And so where is that O2 going to diffuse? Well, it's going to diffuse from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. So it's going to move from the alveolus into the bloodstream. How high will the PO2 get? Well, it's only going to get as high as the PO2 in the alveolus. So when you look at the PO2 of the blood leaving the lungs, it's much higher than it was coming from the tissues, but it's not going to be any higher than it is here in the alveolus because we've reached an equilibrium state. So when you compare the blood coming from the lung or from the tissues to the lungs to the blood that leaves the lungs, note that the PCO2 here has fallen from 45 to 40, but look at what has happened to the PO2. It's gone from 40 up to 104. That's why this blood is bright red in color. Its oxygen levels are much, much, much higher. There's a video here that I cannot play on the voiceover, but when you go to the regular PowerPoint, make sure you watch this video. It's going to just repeat kind of what we just spent the last 10 minutes talking about. So how does the blood carry the majority of oxygen? Well, it utilizes a pigment called hemoglobin. And I think you've all heard of hemoglobin. This pigment found in red blood cells, and there are millions and millions of molecules of this in each one of your red blood cells. Hard to believe, but inside the cytoplasm of a red blood cell are millions of molecules of hemoglobin. And this is a model here on the left-hand side that kind of illustrates the hemoglobin molecule. We have 4 polypeptide chains illustrated here as the various colors of purple. So we have the light, sort of a darker, and a darkest, just to illustrate the fact that there are these 4 polypeptide chains, in the center of which is something called a heme group. Looks like a flying saucer, kind of, if you use your imagination. All right, here's the heme group, the chemistry of the heme group shown here on the right-hand side. It's got these 4 rings, and in the very center you see iron, Fe, iron. So that little circular structure here in the middle of what looks like a little flying saucer, okay, that is the iron right here. In the very center, that's this iron. And the 4 rings make up the outer part of the flying saucer, if you will. So the iron here in the center, the Fe, and I'm sorry, let me see if I can erase that. Yeah, that is where the oxygen actually binds. It chemically binds to the iron. And when O2 binds to the iron of hemoglobin, it changes the color. It becomes very, very bright red. This next insert photo sort of does a nice job showing you what happens when oxygen binds to the hemoglobin. HB is just an abbreviation for this molecule. When O2 binds to hemoglobin, we make something called OxyHemoglobin, meaning it's been charged with oxygen. The oxygen has bonded to the iron. And the color of that oxygenated blood is bright red, very, very bright red. When it gives up its oxygen to the tissues, it turns a much darker red color here. So we can tell by looking at the color of blood as to its oxygen state or lack thereof. The brighter it is, the brighter red, the more oxygen the blood has. The duller, deeper purple red, the less oxygen the hemoglobin has. So this is simply, again, reiterating how at the lungs we've got oxygen poor blood coming from the tissues, and as that blood passes over the surface of those alveoli, some of the CO2 will diffuse out of the blood, go into the alveolus, but quite a bit of oxygen will move from the alveolus into the blood, right? And it turns this bright red color. It's lots of oxyhemoglobin. When that blood gets transported to the heart and the heart pumps into the tissues, what do we want to do? Well, we want to take a lot of that oxygen and we want to have it diffuse across the capillary wall into the tissue cells. So if you look at the PO2 of the tissues, it's at 40. The PO2 of the blood is a little lower than what we had described earlier, which I think was 104. It's dropped down to 95. It's still pretty high. And so quite a bit of that oxygen is going to diffuse from the blood into the tissue cells. How much? Well, if you look at the outgoing blood here, it has a PO2 of 40, which you know happens to be the same as the PO2 of the tissue cells. In other words, we reach equilibrium. We can't go any lower than 40. We've also brought aboard carbon dioxide as well from the tissues into the blood. But note again that this blood is going to be a darker red, even though we use the color blue. It's really going to be this darker deoxygenated blood that we saw in the previous slide. We just depict that darker red as a blue color on or in the blood vessel, as opposed to the bright red oxygenated blood. We would view that or color that as a red color in terms of the color of the blood vessel. But the reality is that this oxygen poor blood is not devoid of oxygen. It still has 40 millimeters of mercury partial pressure in it. Okay, it's not devoid of oxygen. It's just lower. It's oxygen poor blood. That's the term we use. This is oxygen rich blood. This is oxygen poor blood. Your book has a clinical application box there on page 758 that describes some disorders that impair gas exchange. I'd like you to read that over. It talks about pneumonia, tuberculosis, and acute respiratory distress syndrome. Please take some time and look that over. I'm sure in subsequent editions of the textbook, they'll be adding coronavirus, COVID-19 to this, I can guarantee you, because they do mention SARS in here, which was in the news, about 10 or 15 years ago. We've been talking about oxygen transport and the role that hemoglobin plays. I want to spend the rest of this chapter talking about transportation of CO2, carbon dioxide. So we're starting there on page 761. We know that CO2 is an end product, a waste product that our tissue cells make, say our muscles. Think about when you run a race, you know you're building up carbon dioxide as the muscle is contracting. And we've got to then take that CO2 and get rid of it. Got to get it aboard the blood, transport it to the lungs, and then have a lot of that diffuse across the respiratory membrane, and we exhale that CO2. There are three different ways in which blood transports carbon dioxide. So here we are at the tissues. Think of this as the metabolizing skeletal muscle that you're using as you run the race. Take a look at the muscle cell. Let's pretend this is the muscle cell here. It can be any tissue cell of the body. I don't care, any tissue you want to talk about other than the lungs. And that PCO2 of the tissue, 45, as compared to the PCO2 of the blood, 40, just like we saw earlier. So where's CO2 going to move? Well, it's going to diffuse from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. It's going to move from the tissue across the wall of the tissue cell, across the wall of the blood vessel, and get into the bloodstream. And I want you to note that one way in which CO2 is transported in the blood is as CO2 that's dissolved in the plasma. The plasma is the watery portion of blood. It's the extracellular matrix of blood. Okay? So about 7% of the total CO2 that's transported by our body, by our bloodstream, is transported as dissolved CO2, at that form, CO2 gas. A second mechanism by which CO2 is transported in the blood is shown here. So we have the diffusion of the CO2 from the tissue cell into the bloodstream, where about 23% of it will combine with hemoglobin. It doesn't bind where the oxygen binds, okay, which remember was in the center of the heme group where the iron was. This is going to bind at another location on the molecule, on the hemoglobin molecule. I think it's somewhere on the polypeptide, somewhere else besides where the heme group is. Okay, so it's not competing for the iron, competing with the oxygen. It's binding at a different place. And when that CO2, that 23% of the CO2 that's carried by the blood binds, it binds in a separate region and forms what is referred to as carbaminohemoglobin. Carbamino means it's got carbon dioxide bonded. And that blood would be dark red, purple red, right? Indicating the oxygen poor state because it's got CO2 bonded to the hemoglobin. So that's transported inside the red blood cell where the hemoglobin molecules are, right? The mechanism is a little more complicated to explain, but it accounts for the majority of the CO2 transported by the blood. Upwards of 70% of the CO2 that's transported in your body is transported in the form of this ion called the bicarbonate ion. HCO3 with a minus charge, bicarbonate ion. How does that form? Well, let's look at the chemistry here. So here's the CO2 moving from the tissue cell into the blood. It actually goes into the blood cell where a reaction takes place. And you can see this CO2 coming from the tissues combines with water in the red blood cell in the presence of this enzyme called carbonic anhydrase. I know it's an enzyme because it ends in ASE. Any word that ends in ASE is an enzyme. And that carbonic anhydrase is going to take that CO2 in the water and produce a molecule called carbonic acid. We actually talked about this reaction in one of the earlier voiceovers of this chapter. H2CO3, carbonic acid. That carbonic acid, in turn, dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions formed will combine with hemoglobin, and the bicarbonate ion that's forming here is going to leave the red blood cell and go out into the plasma. That's what this arrow is indicating. The bicarbonate leaves the red blood cell, travels into the plasma. Now, when that happens, note the charge here. This is a minus charge. For every bicarbonate ion that leaves the blood and goes into the, there is a chloride ion that's going to go from the plasma into the blood. This is called the chloride shift, and it ensures that there is no significant charge change that takes place. In other words, if a negatively charged bicarbonate leaves the blood and goes into the plasma, we have a chloride ion that comes from the blood and goes into, from the plasma rather, and goes into the red blood cell. So we equalize the charge. One negative charge leaves, one chloride negative charge comes aboard the blood. It's called the chloride shift, and that takes place here in the lungs. So from now to the time it gets to the lungs, that particular bicarbonate, remember, is out here into the plasma. The blood returns back to the heart, to the right half of the heart, and then the heart pumps it to the lungs. And when we get to the lungs, we're a lot of that CO2. Well, remember the 7% that was dissolved in the plasma that we saw earlier? Well, that CO2 is going to move from a higher partial pressure to a lower partial pressure. So there goes the 7% diffusing from the plasma here into the alveolus across the respiratory membrane, which is right here. 23% or so of CO2 that was in the form of this carbaminohemoglobin, okay, it's going to get pulled off of the hemoglobin. Remember, this is in the red blood cell. And that CO2 is then free to diffuse across the respiratory membrane, moving from, again, a higher partial pressure, 45, to a lower partial pressure, 40. So there goes the 23% or so of the CO2. Last mechanism, which is accounting for over 70% or close to 70% of the CO2, is the reverse of what we just described a few minutes ago. Remember, we had this bicarbonate that was out here in the plasma. It now moves into the red blood cell. There it goes, into the red blood cell. Now, when you take a negatively charged bicarbonate and you bring it into the cell, guess what leaves? Well, it's going to be our chloride ions. We have another chloride shift taking place to equalize the charge. Once inside the red blood cell, the bicarbonate is going to then combine with hydrogen ions. Now remember, those were being stored here in the hemoglobin, so that they get pulled off of the hemoglobin. They combine with the bicarbonate, and notice what's made here. This is carbonic acid that we formed a little bit earlier, back in the tissues. And in the presence of that same enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, that bicarbonate, carbonic acid rather, is going to be dissociated or broken down into two products. One is water, but here's the one we're interested in. This is CO2. This is the CO2 that's going to leave the red blood cell, cross that respiratory membrane, and get out into the alveolus. And that's where it'll eventually be exhaled, as will the CO2 coming from the plasma or the CO2 coming from the carbaminohemoglobin. All that CO2 is going to eventually be exhaled from the lungs. And that pretty much wraps up chapter 19. So you're going to want to be familiar with the three mechanisms of CO2 transport.